Good evening. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we meet and we learn from each other on country. I'm coming to you from the State Library of New South Wales, a comparatively young library that sits on one of the world's great ancient libraries, a rich repository of oral tradition. I extend my sincere respect to the elders of the Gadigal people, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who might be here with us this evening for Summer Book Reads. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rachel Franks. I'm the coordinator of scholarship here at the library, which is just a rather fancy way to say that I get to look after the research fellows who are here immersed in our collections for a specific project over 12 or perhaps even 24 months. And if you've seen me here do book club before or do some of the other public programs for the library, you know that I have a bit of a side hustle and that I dabble in death. So it's great fun to be here with you this evening for another fantastic crime novel. Now, I just will flag that there were some obligatory tech problems this afternoon, so I am tethered to help everything stay stable and stay working. So I'll try not to run into mischief with all the cables this evening, but we do have some very tech-savvy colleagues on standby in case anything goes amiss. So, of course, tonight is all about indyreads, which is an ebook and audiobook platform that was developed by the State Library of New South Wales for the New South Wales Public Library Network. One of the main aims behind the indyreads initiative is to provide public library members with access to the very best titles from independent Australian publishers, and of course to showcase Australian authors without some of the normal lending limits that we might otherwise experience. So, as you no doubt are aware, because you've all registered and you're all here this evening, this year's Summer Book Club selection is Michael Brissenden's book, Smoke. Published by Firm Press, which has actually been a really long-term partner with the indyreads project. So it's great to have them on board for this. So a very special welcome to all of you. I understand that quite a few of you are coming in from libraries this evening who are live streaming this event. I know that Wagga has a room all buzzing with readers who have looked at Michael's book. If there are any other libraries out there and you'd like a little bit of a shout out, just let me know using the Q&A feature in Zoom. That's what we'll be using this evening to chat to you all. So we will be using the Q&A feature also for our questions and answers this evening. I, of course, have a few questions for Michael, but it would be great to ask some of your questions as well. So if you have a question, please use that feature and I'll try and ask as many of them as possible. Now, I want you all to be very considerate when you're asking your questions. And no, I'm not worried about bad manners, but I am, as always, very worried about spoiler alerts. So if you have been to a book club with me before, you know that I really don't like to give anything away, especially the ending. So we're recording tonight and the video will be made available. So I don't want to do Michael out of a loan or a book sale because somebody thinks they know who did it. We want them to read the book. So, Michael Brissenden, author of Smoke, worked for the ABC for more than 30 years from the late 1980s as a political journalist and as a foreign correspondent working in Moscow, Brussels and Washington. He covered many of the biggest international stories of the 1990s and the early 2000s from all corners of the globe. A two-time Walkley Award winner, Michael has recently joined the ABC's Four Corners as a reporter. But of course, many of us know him now through his fiction writing. Michael, it's great to see you here for indyreads this evening. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me, Abby. Thanks for your interest. Oh, sorry, Rach.
That's right. Abby is here behind the scenes. She is also very interested. Um, so we've had a little bit of a chat. I had far too many questions, but I've tried to sort of contain myself and I've tried to put them in a bit of a logical order. So hopefully we can get through most of them, but I don't want to sort of cut other people off. So we'll see what we can do. First, I was really interested as a journalist. So you have a lot of training and a lot of experience in writing as a researcher, um, as just the discipline of writing, music to the ears of publishers everywhere. Journalists are well known for being able to meet a deadline. Not all authors manage to do that. But I am curious, the transition into long format writing isn't that unusual for a journalist with a lot of experience, but why fiction instead of non-fiction?
Look, there's a number of reasons. I've always wanted to write fiction, and I have tried on a number of occasions throughout my life. Uh, I've written books before that haven't really, uh, certainly in my 20s and my 30s, that didn't really go anywhere. But I've always been a big fiction reader. I love reading fiction, and I love the fact that it allows you to it allows you to ignore the facts, and it allows you to
Oh,
actually to use, well, not to ignore them, but to use them, but without having to stick to them, and
mm,
it's a very liberating experience as a journalist who has spent a lot of time, within the confines of journalism, to be able to sit down and let the story go wherever it wants to go, to actually be surprised yourself about when you're writing it, where it actually ends up. And I think there is a very different style. It uses a very different writing muscle. And
mm,
really that creative writing is something that it's a very, for me, it's a very challenging thing, but it's a very engaging thing and rewarding thing to do. And after such a long time sort of trying to do it, when it actually did start to work, I was really happy with how it was, with the fact that it did work. And the things that you can say in fiction that you can't say in non-fiction are interesting to me. There's a lot you can sort of say through character and narrative and dialogue
mm.
that you just don't get the opportunity to say in like even a 2 or 3 thousand word feature. The nuances you can't really get into in the same way that you can with fiction. So I really enjoy that about it, and yeah, it's also it's a fun thing to do, and it's very liberating bit of writing.
Certainly, dialogue is a lot more exciting as a writer if you're doing fiction. You're not contained by somebody else and thinking, "Oh no, I've got a much more interesting way to
Well,
say that or make that point." Or
writing journalism, you have to write other people's stories,
mm,
and you have to write what they're saying. If you're writing fiction, you can make up what they're saying. You can get them to say things that actually help move the story along in a way that you just certainly can't do in journalism.
yeah, and I guess one of the other really obvious things is you have more freedom to express personal opinions, or at least opinions that are out there that might then push that plot line along for you. For example, overtly discussing matters such as climate change and workplace sexism, which, sometimes the facts are powerful, but by, imbuing those with a little bit of opinion from experience or broader reading can make readers stop in their tracks and maybe consider things differently. Was that also a motivator as well? Did you have something that you really wanted to say?
Sure, I think that's true, but also you can do it in a very powerful way through your characters and through dialogue
Mm.
in a way that is not sort of, in journalism, when you're dealing with those things, you are dealing with them in a didactic sort of way.
Yeah.
This is whereas in fiction it's much more subtle, and it's and those themes and thematically and those things are about the characters, and in this book, the character Alex Markov. has come up through the ranks of of the cops, of the police, and has dealt as a woman in her early 40s, has dealt with all of those things that all of those police women who
Mm.
I've spoken to a lot over my career have had to deal with to get to that point. And those experiences are very different from the experiences of male police officers. And but you can't just sort of say that. You need to use the character to say that, and that is,
Mm.
you know, that's very satisfying when that works.
Yeah, it can be challenging, but yeah, when you get it right, you feel it, don't you,
Yeah, and
as
one
an
of the
author?
problems I think that journalists have writing fiction is the tendency to try and over-explain. And you sort of have to pull that back a lot. You have to sort of say, well, you know, this is not a piece of journalism, right? This is a piece of fiction. It's entertainment, but it's also got to be, you know, intellectually engaging. You want it to be, but
Mm.
you want people who are readers to join the dots. You know, you can't sort of lay it all out for everybody.
Yes, here's my three-page background briefing for the editor that I'll just slip in as a prologue. Um, so interestingly, once you'd made that decision to fiction, which all makes perfect sense, um, a lot of fiction relies on conflict to push the plot, to make the dialogue interesting in the first place, to give the characters something to sort of antagonize over. Um, and sometimes it's the contentious issues of the day, sometimes it's a bit more generic human squabbling. Um, do you think that playing around with conflict on the page, that crime fiction was a more obvious choice for you rather than other genres? Did you consider other types of
Uh,
fiction?
Look, that's an interesting question. I don't really know the answer to that. I don't even think I set out to write crime fiction. You know, I just think that my experience and my background and the things that I bring to what I'm writing about,
Mm,
particularly when I started. So the first book I did was called The List, which was a book really about it was really a reflection of where we were at the time. I was the defense and security correspondent for the ABC, and we were talking a lot at that time in the around about 2015, 2016 about the terror threat here in Australia. So this was a way for me to actually write a lot of the stuff that I couldn't write in journalism because, like I said before, it just doesn't cover the nuances of what
yeah.
on, on all sorts of levels. You know how that's affecting the immigrant communities, how it's affecting the cops, how it's affecting the security services, how it's affecting the media, what the media are doing. You know, all that sort of stuff comes into play. And in fiction, you can actually layer that in a way through character and dialogue and place and action. Um, so uh, I think when all of that started to work, I realized how, in a way, how sort of satisfying it was to write, but also how you could say so much in doing it. You know, I'm
Mm.
not sure that's the answer to the question, but
Yeah.
uh,
It actually makes me think of something else, though. I'm going to slip another question in. How different for you is the editing process from being a journalist to being a fiction writer?
look, uh, that's it's not terribly different. I mean, I always say to editors who are a bit intimidated, you know, by me, you know, in a way which I think is sort of a bit weird. But I say to them, look, you know, just bring it on because you haven't sat through a Four Corners edit session, right? Nothing is as frightening as that, and that is rigorous and tough, and they chuck it all against the wall and justify every sentence and pull it all back.
Yeah.
You know, I think I am used to a very rigorous editing process, and I actually really, really enjoy it. And I think it's really important, as long as it's constructive, as long as everybody's working to make it the best possible thing, uh,
Mm.
and we're all working for the same goal. Then you know I love the editing process, and some people are a bit daunted by it, but I actually think it's nobody's perfect, right? You're just
No.
not produce a perfect book, and it's not even after an editing, it's not going to be a perfect book. But everybody is trying to make it the best book possible, and I think that's a great process. But I do think I bring to it some experience of some pretty tough editing.
Because, I mean, editors, sometimes they do get a bit of a bad rap, but they are really on the author's side. They're so invested in seeing books succeed. But yes, we all have nightmares about misplaced commas and all those sorts of things. Um, so more specifically about smoke, in my own work on true crime and crime fiction, I've often commented that crime is universal. That's one of the reasons I love these narratives so much, because it has absolutely zero respect for historical timelines or eras. It doesn't care about cultural or geographical boundaries. And I was really struck with your opening pages and the idea that fire and the fear of fire is also absolutely universal. And so I was wondering about how you picked that as a driving theme for this particular novel. I mean, obviously you've had experience reporting on fire and you bring that to your work, but was there a particular motivation or a
Well, there really
particular
was for this.
moment?
Yeah, there really was for this book. So, uh, the idea for it came to me as I was driving down the Hume Highway between Sydney and Canberra on the day that these big fires in 2019 happened on the south coast of New South Wales, and the day was that the Currawong fire, the big fire, jumped the highway and went into it burnt down to the coast at a place where my family has had a little coast house that my parents bought in the 1950s, and we couldn't contact anybody because everything went out. All
Ah,
all the phones went down. No one knew what was going on. All I could do was listen to the ABC's emergency broadcast, who was basically telling me that everybody there had been told it was too late to leave and shelter in place. Right. So this is a pretty big moment when you know people in that community and you can't contact them and you don't know what's going on. So perversely, what came to me at that time was, well, what if somebody used that moment as cover for a crime? So,
not an obvious segue for everybody, but yeah, let's go with that.
you know, this premise came to me. I thought, well, this is pretty interesting, right? So everybody's got this terrible moment happening. And what happens when the smoke clears or doesn't clear, but is when the fire is pushed through and people are sifting through it and they find a body? Now, is the body a victim of the fire or is the body a victim of something more nefarious? And in this case, as we know in the book, it's not giving anything away, but it starts by finding the body, but it's pretty quickly, it quickly becomes apparent that somebody's used the fire as cover to. So I just thought that was fascinating. And then, you know, what happens as a result of not just that crime, but the impact on the community after the fire? What is, you know, there is this whole thing about fire, which I find fascinating in that it's sort of, you know, after a bushfire, you can see all of these things that you never ever thought you never could see before because the canopy's been ripped away, the
Yeah.
scrub gone, and suddenly you're seeing ravines and gullies you never knew were there. Sometimes you're seeing structures that you never knew that were there, or abandoned cars and water tanks and all sorts of things. So there are all sorts of things revealed after the fire that you will otherwise never see. And the same thing is apparent in the communities because it rips the sort of top off a community and places a whole lot of pressure on people that they otherwise wouldn't have had. And so all of these things start coming to the surface that are caused by the fire, by the pressure and intensity of what happened during the fire and what happens after the fire. So
Afterwards.
all of that stuff I found was interesting and something that I wanted to explore.
So your descriptions of fire and its aftermath are, you know, quite, let's go with realistic. Um, I could almost smell burning stuff at some points. And so it was really quite close to home. But because you've set it in California, it also felt kind of safely, oh, it's, you know,
Mm.
it's over there. What underpinned your decision to set the book in America rather than Australia?
Well, that did actually, because I initially started writing it about a sort of, I didn't want to write about the community I knew. I wanted to write about a fictional community.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah.
I didn't want to talk about. I didn't want to bring people who knew me into the narrative anyway, or for anybody to think that it was in any way about their experience. But I did start writing about a fictional place in New South Wales. I invented this place. And then I have covered, as a correspondent, fires in California and fires in Australia. So I have pretty broad experience in covering that. And I knew there were a lot of similarities between the way fires tear apart communities in both places. And when I started writing it, it started to rain in New South Wales and just rained and rained and rained. But it started to burn in California and in Greece. And I thought, well, here's an opportunity actually to really take it out of
Okay.
and put it somewhere completely different. There were a lot of things that I needed to do to research that weren't the same, but there are some big similarities. It's a very similar forest management culture, for instance. So, there's a lot of plantation forestry. There's a lot of, I guess, ignorance about traditional burning culture, which, we are now starting to sort of engage with in this country, but they're not really, we're not really doing it to the extent that perhaps we should have. There are so many, like there are small towns that are basically timber towns that are no longer timber towns. All of that sort of stuff. There were lots of very similar themes there as there are here, but there are quite a lot of differences as well, certainly in police procedure and, for instance, in this case, the detective goes from a major city back to a town, and if you did that in New South Wales or Victoria or Western Australia or anywhere state in Australia, you could do it within the same police force. You can't do that in California because it's 75 different police jurisdictions. So there were all sorts of things that were different, and I needed to know where Alex would have lived in LA and what sort of experience she would have had going through the police force and all that sort of stuff. So I had to go and do quite a lot of research, but on the broader sort of themes, it's remarkable how similar those themes were. But it did allow me to take it out of here completely, put it somewhere else, and also gave me a bit of freedom about how far you could go with some of those themes, because there are lots of things happening in this book. There's healthcare.
There really are.
Healthcare challenges, there's drugs, there's all sorts of things happening, poverty, and yes, we have all of those problems here, but you put it in a small town in America and those problems are magnified even more because of the sort of cutthroat sort of society that America is. So, yeah, that's why I did it.
It's interesting because it's such a big decision, as you say, a lot of extra research to sort of fine tune all of those, the procedural details once you start working with big organisations. But I'd like to talk about character for a few questions at least. So the central protagonist is critical to any novel, and I'm going to reveal a little bit of personal bias here and declare that I think that the lead investigator in a crime novel has to do much more heavy lifting than most. You can sort of forgive some imperfections in the way a lead character is constructed for other genres, but if you can't invest and trust in your lead detective, I think it makes it much harder to embrace a crime novel. Now, I think Detective Alex Markov is perfect for that heavy lifting or that lifting up of a story, but I was struck too by how I saw her as a character, but also how she was reflected in the landscape, which in some ways is a character in its own right, almost, in your book. And this is always slightly intimidating when I read somebody else's book in front of them, but I'm going to do it anyway and try and get this right. So this was one of the first lines that just really struck me in the novel. Alex passed the turnoff to the lookout, before the last bend, before the road broke through the forest. She thought of Pigeon Rock, how it was still there, solid, resolute, while everything around it had changed. The forest, the weather, the lives of the people who came and went. So I just I thought it was interesting that I saw Alex kind of as that rock, and then the exterior of her and her traumas in sort of shifting location, all the stuff that she goes through as kind of that surface damage that the fire produces in the landscape. So I'm just wondering, am I trying to read too much into it? Was it intentional? Are you thinking about resilience in a whole bunch of different ways and bringing them together?
Yeah, I think that I think, look, we're all a little bit like that, aren't we? We have
We
there
try, maybe.
we have a sort of central rock, but there is so much going on as well that that is unstable, you know.
Mm,
Um, and she has had she's under a lot of pressure. She's under a lot
mm,
of pressure in so many ways. And she's trying to deal with all of that pressure, but at the same time, she's clinging to the things that uh, to her past, right? The same can be said of her father, Leo. The same can be said of some of the other characters in the book. Everybody's changed by this fire on the surface, right? And how that impacts on what they are, on what they were, and where they're going, and that sort of, and in that particular case, she's remembering her quite sort of idyllic childhood in a way, before things all went wrong, um, which was well before the fire. But
mm,
you know, there are things that remain solid about your life, and then there are things you can't control, and the things that happen that will never be solid. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but I think we're all, we all have those things, and the more you can, your protagonist has got to be a complex, complicated, interesting, engaging individual, and the more you can inject that sort of stuff into that person, I think the better for the reader.
mm. Because it's interesting too. So often, um, detectives can be a bit of a fish out of water, and that's where the conflict comes from. They're in new surroundings, they've got new people around them, and all that sort of stuff. So it was interesting that you took her from a big city where there was potentially more conflict available to her, and took her back to a small town and back to the familiar almost. Um,
Unresolved conflict as well back there.
yeah,
So otherwise, there's conflict that she sort of ran away from and then was forced to re-engage with in a completely different environment under different pressures.
she has to work hard.
She does.
And just on that idea of, she, um, was that a deliberate decision as well? Like, did you want to
Yeah,
structure, have those gendered expectations,
definitely.
feed into the conflict?
Yeah, so I have always wanted to write. Uh, I think, as I mentioned, I have over my time met a lot of women who have gone through, cops basically, who've got to a certain point. And their experience are very different from the male cops. They're under a lot of different
Mm,
pressures. And often they get to sort of their late 30s, uh, early 40s, and they hit a ceiling and they can't go any further. And they've given up so much to get to that point, right? To be a cop over that period of time, you've got to have done the shift work, you've got to have done the bad
mm,
things, you've got to have been to, the things that you've seen and experienced, the shift work you've had to do, the people you've had to constantly butt up against, who really, it's a very misogynistic environment,
mm,
and uh, I have always wanted to write a character that reflected that, and this was the opportunity to do that, and so a lot of her experience is stuff that I have, been told directly by female police officers about their own experience, and where they've ended up at a certain point in time. You know, sometimes they get to this point, they've sacrificed everything, they've got no family, their
Yeah.
relationships are busted, you know, because it's very hard to be in a relationship with someone who's constantly doing shift work and dealing with nasty stuff all the time. You know, it's tough. And you know, often the relationships are with other cops because they're the only people who can deal with it, and those relationships are not particularly healthy often. So those are the sorts of things I wanted to reflect in that character. Yeah.
So I'm going to be a little bit naughty and just sneak in a question that's come in from the outside world. Somebody's asking if you specifically base your characters on people that you have met over your career, or if they're like almost a montage of a group of people that you've met or dealt with.
Uh, that's a good question, and it's the answer to that is both. So I mean, Alex, for instance, you know, she's just really a reflection of some of the conversations that I've had with these people. There's nobody particularly, nobody, you know, she doesn't reflect anyone in particular, but her father does, or a number of people, and certainly her mother does. So her mother is in a is a dementia sufferer in a nursing
Mm.
home, and that becomes part of the you know, it's under a lot of development pressure, and but the experience of the mother was an experience that I personally experienced with my mother. So uh, a lot of the way she behaves and the interaction between the mother and Alex is a pretty direct uh, example of my own experience. There was a real
Is
reflection of my experience.
is that harder to write, or is that almost cathartic?
I actually felt, you know, when I started doing it, I wasn't really sure, and the longer, the more it progressed, the more comfortable and sort of good about it I felt, and I thought, uh, you know, she deserved it. You know, she deserved to have this. Not that she deserved what was happening to her, but she deserved to have
Yeah.
a place in the book. You know, that was something that was really, you know, I dedicated the book to her, and it really was something that felt good to me to do it, to sort of honor her in a way, you know. And the father is a reflection of a lot of, you know, when I was a correspondent in Moscow in the early 90s, I met a lot of people who um, were a lot of men of a particular age who were survivors of the gulags. And at
Mm.
that time, they were still around, but they were very, very damaged individuals. And they really, you know, had no, like, they just wanted to get the hell out of there. Like, and so I always wanted to explore that somehow. And this character is not directly related to that. In fact, he's more directly related to somebody else I met who was a weird dog shooter. But I melded the two characters, and
Yeah.
that worked, right? Uh, so, so yes, it's a combination of everything. I think we all bring our experience to our fiction, and then
Mm.
sometimes some characters just completely invented, you know, like out of nowhere.
Yeah, I think a mix is good. I think people can feel when a character is real and is easier to identify with for, whether that sparks good or less good memories of their own experiences.
Mm.
Um, yeah, because you need to write about what you know to a certain extent, but we don't like to imagine all of our crime writers having hands-on professional development, actually murdering people. That's not how we want to play the game.
No.
Um, okay, so writing out of gender is one thing. Writing out of culture can be a bit more challenging and also a lot more controversial. You can really expose yourself to a lot more criticism than you might otherwise endure. Can you talk us through writing a Native American character, which of course makes absolutely perfect sense in the book? And I think it would have been a really glaring omission if you tried to sort of avoid that challenge, if you like. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, firstly, absolutely right. I don't think you can write a book set in a regional town like that where,
No.
there are all of these issues that are absolutely coursing through the society, which, without recognizing that the Indigenous people have a place in the landscape and in the culture and in the town. I would never write. So it's important to have that element in the story. Uh, in this story in particular, it's also important because, much like it is here, their forest management practice has been ignored. Those people have been marginalised through the colonisation experience for a couple of hundred years.
Mm.
Many of them were pushed off the land only to then go in and be forced to go in and exploit the land to actually survive on the land. So a lot of them went into forestry themselves, and then were the collateral damage when the forest industry rationalised and a lot of the small sawmills were closed. Very similar story to what happened here in Australia. But I would not write a story. I would not write a character like that through their eyes, right? So I'm not, this. It's
Yeah.
he is there in the story, but I'm not actually. He's not driving the story. He's part of the story, and I wouldn't try and sit inside his head. Like, it's always somebody else looking at how he is reacting, and he's part of the dialogue and his story.
Mm.
But it's not, not telling the story from his perspective. But he is an important part of the story. Yeah. What else was I going to say about that?
Did you talk to anybody
Oh
specifically,
yes.
or?
So and the other thing is very important, I think, to actually engage with. So it's a big story about this. I tried to part of my research. I tried to get engagement with Indigenous Native American institutions and organizations and cultural groups and whatever in California, and nobody was responding to me. It was, it was a very, very frustrating experience. But my experience as a journalist is we just go and knock on the door. So,
Of course you do.
so I knew there was an area in California where I had covered a fire before, and I knew that there was an Indigenous cultural presence there. And I looked up, and they had a website, and they had an email address, and they had a street address. They didn't answer their emails. So I thought, well, I'll just go into the street address. So I put it in my Google Maps, and I drove for 6 hours up in the mountains, and I get there and the place is burnt down. So there was nobody there.
Oh,
So I thought, what am I going to do? And the place is burnt down. There was this guy walking in the street, and I said, I can find the local Native American community. And he said, I've got no idea. Go down to the campground, they might know. So I went down to the campground by the lake, and the woman in the campground said, well, actually, they own this land. I'll give you a number. So I gave a number, and I rang this woman who was the head of the tribe. And she said to me, this is amazing. You're the first person who's ever asked us about this. I said to her, I'm writing this book, and I want to talk to you about your burning practices, about whether people have ever engaged with you about it, what the impact of all of this has been on you, and all this stuff. She said, no one's ever asked us this before, which I thought it was pretty amazing in itself. And then she put me onto I think he was a younger man in his 40s who was their sort of cultural officer, who was very, very helpful. And he gave me all that stuff in the book about how for such a long time during the 20th century, the elders were not allowed to follow their cultural burning practices by the national parks, but they would go around anyway with Zippo lighters at the right time and do it illegally and light up the forest with one eye on the forest and one eye looking for the ranger. And this happened all the way up, apparently, in this area up until the turn of the century, about the early 2000s, when a lot of those old elders, a lot of the elders died out, and the practice died out with them. So nothing's happened. No burnings in 20 years, 25 years. So that's why there's this sort of part of the reason why there is this big build-up of fuel in the forests at the moment. So all of that stuff. He gave me those stories, and about the fact that they worked in, small mill towns, and the
Mm.
forest been rationalized and they no longer had anywhere to go, but a lot of them were still living in the mill towns. Yeah.
Was it hard trying to promote your book and talk about your book while those really horrendous fires were burning in California?
Well, that only happened fairly recently, and I think it
Yeah,
must have happened after, so I don't know when the California fires, the LA fires started in December,
yeah.
and smoke had been out since June. So I'd had a lot of publicity up, and a lot of the publicity work had been done before that. But it's pretty interesting, isn't it? How, I mean, uh, California burns every year. This is the other thing. Like every year now, some big fire happens in California or in the west
Mm.
of the US. And the surprising thing about the LA fires was that it happened in winter. But it just goes to show how dry it is at the moment over there, and
Yeah.
how volatile the place is.
I'm sure it would have been startling reading for some readers doing this for indyreads, and they're reading your book
Yeah,
on their commute home from work and then seeing all this footage on the
yeah.
6 o'clock news. Um, I want to go back to Alex and crafting characters to interact with her. Um, how did So you have a lot of people in this book, and I'm just wondering how they influenced each other and sort of how you imagined them. Did you construct Alex first and have a really solid idea of who she was, or did you kind of create this community in draft and then fabricate somebody to put in the middle of all of that?
No, so I did have a very good idea of her, and I had a very good idea of her father, and I had a very good idea
Okay.
of their relationship and of what had happened between them to tear their family apart, and the pressures that had been put on their family. So I knew I had that. Um, the other characters sort of just uh, they weren't quite as formed, but I think they fell in around the narrative, so uh, uh, it's the right way to say it. Uh, I don't really go into great detail when I'm, I don't plot in great detail. But I do sort of know generally where I'm going. But I also know that I'm going to need characters that are going to allow these main characters to shine,
Do their thing.
to
Yeah.
do the, to expose themselves, to show their weaknesses and their strengths. And there were some important characters that were required to do that in this story, in this narrative, like the local cops, particularly the local media, these players that were going to be very important to the story. So those characters develop as you're writing and as you're drafting, as you're going back. Yeah.
How do you keep track of them all?
Well, I'm
Some
going
people
to.
like post-it notes, some people have a really elaborate spreadsheet.
Yeah.
Um,
I actually, I know people read the book and go, wow, there's a lot of people, a lot of characters in this book. It never occurred to me that there were. Like there are main characters and there are some peripheral characters.
yeah.
Main characters all serve a very strong purpose in driving the narrative. And to me, it wasn't really hard to keep track of them at all because they all really circled around Alex. Like she is the central character, and those other characters all came off her in a way that um, I never found it hard to keep track of them. They were driving the narrative, and the narrative was driving them in a way. So, but I know a lot of people who've read it sort of come to me and said, "Wow, there's a lot of characters in there," and go back in it and you think, yeah, there are, but um,
Everyone has everyone serves a purpose. They're
everyone
not
serves a
just
purpose, and there are only really like a group of core characters who are really
mm.
sort of to where the story's going.
Now you have alluded to this. This is my, you know, standard question to all crime fiction writers. It's the one that makes me the most anxious to ask. Um, do you plot, or are you a plotter or a pantster? Do you just make it up as you go?
I'm a combination of the two. Often I'll just start with an image or an idea, like as I was saying before, the image of
Mm,
the idea, the premise, and the image of the body after the fire, and what rolls out after that. So, in this instance, when I started thinking about that, and I started thinking about, uh, what the story was, it really was the characters that came first, and
okay.
uh, once the characters had sort of once Alex and her father had started to really sort of form for me, then I needed to think about how I was going to do it, where I was going to place it, how the story was going to unfold. And I sort of knew how it was going to end, and I sort of knew what it was going to be, where the big shift was going to happen. But I didn't really know how I was going to get there. So I think that's for me the magic of the writing process. And I know everybody's different, right? Some people
Yeah.
post-it notes of every scene. They know exactly what's going to do before they write. I don't think I could do that. I mean, I like getting to the point where the writing goes off and I go, wow, how did it get there? I didn't see that coming, right? If I didn't see that coming, hopefully the reader didn't see it coming.
Yeah,
You
that's a good point.
um,
Well, I'm
yeah.
only slightly anxious now. I think you need to know where you're going to end up. Otherwise, you just get lost and you,
yeah,
you
yeah,
just
yeah,
get to Little Land and you don't get any further.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, it's sort of, you do need to have some space for flexibility and creativity
I could
along
never.
the way.
I think I agree. You sort of need to have you need to have a general idea of where you're going. Otherwise, you're just going to get lost and go down all sorts of
Mm.
burrows. But I'm not a dedicated plotter. No.
So, around the writing style of this novel, so I was particularly struck with how you're able to sort of switch between what I saw as two really very distinct approaches to presenting words on a page. And you have some passages that are quite descriptive, very romantic in style, almost Victorian in how you unpack the landscape in particular. And then you can really draw attention to a change of pace with, I don't mean this in an unkind way, but some really brittle statements in this book, like small town cops, fuck, they have no idea. And
Mm.
suddenly you've completely changed the pace and the language, and something that you may have pulled apart and teased out over a couple of pages. Suddenly you're saying something really different, and you've said, I'm going to do this in 8 words.
Mm.
Does that happen as you're writing, or are you?
I think often that the I mean you know I love good writing, right? Everybody does. When they're reading something, whether it's crime fiction, whether it's whatever it is, if there's some passage that you go, wow, that is I mean, if I can do that for people without overdoing it, without it
Yeah,
being, then that to me is a success. But often those hard edges, the sharp bits, come through dialogue and character. So people don't talk like that. People talk hard and fast, and
yeah.
um, people are pretty sort of direct. You know, that's the way people are. But you want to write as well. You want people to be engaged with the writing. So um, uh, I think, I mean, it's interesting you say that's what you took from it, which is good. Because I do want to celebrate the writing, but I also think that um, uh, much of the story can be turned on what people say or think, and how they
Mm,
do that is often very sharp, right? So And yes, you can make a point through dialogue, and then you can paint a picture of where they are and what they're doing and why they're doing it through narrative. So and descriptive work. So I hope it works, but that's
Well, it
that's
does
what
work,
I'm
and I
trying
think
to
it's one
do.
of the yeah, it's a really challenging
Mm.
thing because you can try for it and you can just get there, and if you try too hard, if that makes sense,
Yeah, yeah,
then
you
you
can
can
overwrite for sure.
overshoot, and
Absolutely.
then
Yeah.
it's labor on the page. You don't want the writer wants to work hard, or maybe not so hard, depending on how committed they are, but I don't think anybody wants the reader to work
No,
that
no.
hard.
But you want them to be excited at times about what they're reading and engaged with
Oh
what they're,
yeah,
you know. Yeah, but you're right. You don't want to overdo it, and you don't want to labor it. You don't want it to be, we're writing entertainment, and that's really what we're
bit
doing.
of escapism.
Yeah, we are
Yeah.
writing a story that's you want people to be propelled by.
Now, there is a great line, which I'm sure many of the librarians online this evening would have giggled at. Um, should the council do more to keep libraries open? Which I thought was delightful. So I know you've done some events at libraries, technically at a library here this evening. Um, how do you use libraries to write? Do you
Look,
use them as
I
workplaces, as research centres?
all of the above. I love libraries. I always have. I think they are an extraordinary, and I'm not, just saying this because they're a great resource, and they're often, particularly in regional towns, they're like the sort of cultural heart of the community, and they serve. They are so important in keeping words, books, and engagement alive in places that often, uh, don't have access. They don't have a bookshop. They don't have, and a library is great. But I grew up in Canberra, and with the National Library, which I have to say is one of the most beautiful buildings, and also a great resource, an incredible resource. If you want to go there and find anything about anything, you can go there and people will be there to help you as well. And it's a beautiful writing space if you want to find somewhere
Mm,
just to sort of sit and write on your own. So, on all sorts of levels, I think libraries are important, but I think they're particularly important in regional communities. And the number of times that I've done events in regional libraries have always been incredibly rewarding.
mm,
It's great because people are engaged and enthused, and it's great. It's a good event.
mm. And of course, if you're based in Sydney, you can come and use the Mitchell Reading Room. We
Yeah.
also have a lovely building. Not that it's a competition, but I just
Mitchell, you know, the State Library here, the building is just incredible, right? It's amazing, and the
and it
resources
is.
there are so
Yeah.
too.
And there is a nice camaraderie, like this silent solidarity when you're writing in a library space, that everybody's beavering away. Um, yeah, there's a nice motivation, and you're not at home and tempted to clean out the fridge because the scene isn't working as planned. It's more discipline,
Yeah.
less opportunities for
I
procrastination.
don't do it all the time, but I do it. And when I do, I get a lot out of it. It's always a good thing to do. Also, you're surrounded by books,
Mm.
what it's a great environment to be trying to write one in.
Now, I have been slipping in aspects of people's questions and asking people's questions directly as we go, because the Q&A feature has been a little bit more straightforward than chat in the way that your material appears. So thank you for everybody out there contributing to the conversation. If you have anything else you'd like to ask, now is your chance. Um, but I'm going to ask just one more question, because I was looking at some of the interviews that you've done recently about your writing, and I found this absolutely fantastic line. In fiction, your characters can say what you want them to say, and then if you don't like them, you can just kill them off. How therapeutic is that? Um, so did you, this is a two-part question. It's a little bit unfair, but um, pretty straightforward. Did you kill off anybody in Smoke, not to further the plot and for the noble cause of the whodunit, but just because they started to irritate you?
No, I didn't. But I think that is a reflection of the freedom of writing fiction, is that you can basically do what you want. And you know, I'm in control, right? I'm in control of this narrative. And if someone, you know, even figuratively killing someone off, if I don't actually like the way a character is or is developing, or if I want to make them more disagreeable, I can do it. It's then nothing's stopping me. That's what I can do, and that is a great freedom in fiction to be able to do that.
Now, the flip side of that, and this is my part two of that question, and perhaps it's the more important question, did anybody, maybe Alex, hold your attention enough that you might consider a sequel?
Look, I think there's a lot more to discover in her. Like, I do think that there is a sequel in her, but I I don't necessarily want to write another book set in America yet.
Mm.
I did it for those specific reasons, and it worked, and I'm very happy with the way it worked. But uh, the next book I've written is not set in America, and maybe if that book does do well in America and there's some interest in another book with her as the main protagonist, I would do it. And I definitely think there is a lot of room there for her to develop. But um, I don't know. I think I'm probably a little reluctant to be. I don't want to be an American. I don't want to be a writer, Australian writer, writing about America all the time.
Mm.
It worked in this instance, but I think uh, I'd never say never with her, um, but not at the moment.
So we've just got a couple of minutes. So I'm just going to quickly, I've tried to answer or ask as many of your questions as possible and weave things in. Somebody's saying that they would like a fiction story set in Russia using your experience as a journalist. So yes, lots of potential for a crime story
I
coming out
haven't
of
been there for a long
Moscow.
time. It would have to be historical fiction. And that's possible.
Um, Somebody's asking, just out of interest, Michael, what informed your connection with asthma?
That was actually, that's a good question. That was actually an experience of my family experience. My father
Mm.
is a sufferer, and he actually died of an asthma attack, but
Oh,
it was related to, he had Parkinson's disease and other things happening at the time. But so he had this terrible asthma attack and died as a result of that. But complications for whole lots of other things. But so
yeah.
I was very, I did know a lot about someone struggling with asthma. Yeah. Mm.
So many truths in your fiction. It's so intriguing to see all these things sort
Well, I
of
think, as I said before, I think
unravel.
everybody brings their own experience
Mm.
in ways to their fiction, and you call on your own life a lot when you're writing these
Mm.
things. Yeah,
Sometimes you can make it funnier, which is always an advantage.
very cool.
I'm going to finish with one really quick and slightly quirky question, but I like the way it kind of flips our conversation a little bit. In your years as a journalist, have you ever encountered a situation or event where you thought it was so unusual that everyone would think it was fiction?
Oh, look, I think that happens all the time. And what's the old saying? Truth is always stranger than fiction.
Stranger than fiction.
Um, you
Yeah.
know, I think it's a bit hard in the time of Trump, where nothing's off the table in terms of how fantastical it can become. But yeah, look, there are so many there are so many moments you come across where you think, well, if I actually put that in a book, people would think it was too much. You know, how could you, that just wouldn't happen. And in fact, it
And
happened.
then sometimes if you completely fabricate something, people assume that it just happened to you. So, yeah, one of the joys of creative writing, and it makes it a bit more of a mystery to us as readers. So it is right on 7:30. Lots and lots of great comments about libraries, about reading, about writing, about this book in particular. Someone's just typed in, I enjoyed and romped through your precise and descriptive text.
Good.
So I don't think you can get a much better or pithier review to end that on. So from me here at the State Library of New South Wales, a shout out to my colleagues that make this and indeed the whole Indie Reads program possible. So thank you to Ross, Andrea and Abby. And thank you, of course, very much to Michael Brissenden. And I'm sure we all just will sit back and wait. If it's not another book with Alex, it will at least be another book. So
Another one
we
coming
have
this year.
something
There's
to
another
look
one
forward to.
a bit later this year. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much and stay safe, everybody. I'll see you in Library Land soon. Good night.